Yo guys, what's up? It's the Tominator. So I know this is sort of old news by now, and I'm sure you've already heard Dorian Yates' opinion on the 2019 Olympia champ Brandon Curry. But in case not, here's the clip.
um, Brandon Curry, this physique, he definitely wouldn't place in the top six.
He wouldn't
He
place in the
wouldn't
top
place in
six
the
in the
top
90s?
six, no.
Why do you say that? Is it purely based on you guys were more
Because
disciplined than today?
I don't know the reasons, all the factors involved. But you look at the top six in the 90s, you had myself, Kevin Levrone, Flex Wheeler, Sean Ray, Nasser Sambate. I believe all those physiques are superior to the winners that we had in the last couple of years.
Okay, so nothing too crazy there, right? Nothing too controversial. But I'm going to go ahead and give you one simple reason why it's bullcrap, okay? Because here's the thing. There was never even a single year in the 90s where all those guys he just mentioned were simultaneously on their A game. Not even once. Does that mean they'd have to be at 100% to beat a 2019 Brandon Curry? Not necessarily, because Curry himself wasn't at 100%, but still, I think Yates is exaggerating somewhat. Now, I'm not suggesting Brandon would actually win back then because the 90s were indeed stacked and highly competitive, but to claim he wouldn't even make top 6 is absurd. If Yates had said top 3, I probably even could have lived with that, but top 6 is taking it a little too far. All that ayahuasca Dorian's been drinking lately must have messed up his memory because he clearly seems to be imagining some fictional 90s all star lineup that never existed. Let's go through it year by year though, and you can tell me. So, in 1990, the top 6 were this: Haney, Labrada, Ray, Mike Christian, Rich Gaspari, and Francis Benfato. A pretty elite list right here, you gotta admit. But Curry would blow them all away size-wise, even Haney. The only way Curry doesn't oust at least a couple of these guys is if we're judging the contest solely based on conditioning. Because even shape-wise, and in terms of proportions and symmetry and all the rest, Brandon measures up pretty favorably. I would definitely have him no lower than 4th. In 1991, you had Haney once again, Vince Taylor, Labrada, Ray, and Sonny Schmidt. Plus the debut of Dorian Yates himself, who finished runner-up. Now, again, I'm not suggesting Curry would beat all these guys, but could he take out a couple of them on size alone? You bet he could. You gotta remember, the Olympia is, and always has been, for the most part, a big man's game. So conditioning isn't enough on its own. 1992 marks the start of Yates' reign. It was him, Kevin Levrone, Lee Labrada, Sean Ray, Momo Benaziza, and Vince Taylor rounding out the top 6. Conditioning-wise, these guys were all pretty outstanding. But again, to think that Curry wouldn't totally overwhelm them with size is pretty ignorant. Just to put it in perspective, even Dorian at this time was only about 230 pounds while standing at a height of 5'10". That's about 2 to 3 inches taller than Brandon, who, in contrast, weighed roughly 265 on stage. So again, to anyone who thinks the young Dorian wouldn't get totally outmuscled, you're kidding yourself. And not saying Brandon would win, but his size advantage alone would virtually guarantee a top 6 placement. Even in 1993, Dorian's most famous and formidable form ever, he was only about 257 pounds. Absolutely huge for the time, but still not as massive as Curry, especially when we factor in the height difference. Granted, Dorian's conditioning was light years ahead, and I'm not saying Brandon would have beat him there, but aside from Yates himself, he would have made the rest of the field look like a bunch of classic physique competitors, which, they essentially were. Still, this was a very strong top 6 this year with Flex Wheeler, Ray, Labrada, Levrone, and Dillette filling in spots 2 through 6. At the very least, Brandon should be able to overcome Paul Dillette since he didn't even know how to pose. Okay, in 1994 you had Dorian, Ray, Levrone, Dillette, Porter Cottrell, and Chris Cormier. And I can tell you right now, Curry's definitely cracking top 6 because he is definitely beating Porter Cottrell, okay? This dude was the odd man out amidst all these other Hall of Famers, and I personally don't see anything special about his physique that would keep Brandon at bay. I would also have him easily ahead of Chris Cormier here, who looks polished but positively delicate at this early stage of his career. So, there's the first half of the 90s, and I reckon Brandon Curry would place top 6 every year. Now, if Dorian had said something like Brandon's conditioning in 2019 wasn't top 6 worthy, I would fully agree with that. But bodybuilding is more than just great conditioning. That's an integral part of the equation, but you can't just be ripped while giving up 30 to 50 pounds and expect to win. That approach never worked for someone like Andreas Munzer, nor some of the smaller competitors like Sean Ray, Rich Gaspari, or Lee Labrada. Dorian won because he had conditioning plus all that mass, not to mention arguably the greatest back of all time, and he was surprisingly effective in the mandatory poses to boot. So while it's true Brandon's conditioning wasn't up to that level, it's not like he was horribly off and holding all kinds of water either. No, he was still relatively dry and hard and grainy, he just lacked sharp separation. But his shape was good, his proportions were on point, his posing was respectable, and his symmetry was excellent. Even his highly criticized legs would have looked positively gargantuan by 1990 standards, and he would have dwarfed all these guys in the side shots with his extreme fullness and thickness. Anyway, let's move on to the second half now. 1995 featured a rematch between Dorian Yates and Kevin Levrone, who went first and second, just as they did back in 92. Nasser El-Sambadi was third, Sean Ray came in fourth, Vince Taylor fifth, and Chris Cormier landed in sixth place once again. This is another stacked lineup. Probably the best top 6 we've seen so far, along with 93, but Brandon would have surely had enough firepower to at least defeat Taylor and Cormier, who themselves were not particularly well conditioned at this show. Alright, in 1996 you had Dorian, Ray, Levrone, Wheeler, Dillette, and Coleman. Talk about a lineup from hell. Even the up-and-coming Ronnie was a straight-up beast and probably should have finished higher than he did. This is the first time where I'm legitimately doubtful if Brandon could make top 6. But again, I'd argue that he should knock off Dillette on posing alone. It's not as evident from still photos as when you watch him in motion, but let's just say that if you can't hit and hold the mandatories properly, it doesn't matter how good your physique is. It's a testament to Dillette's outstanding genetics that he ever managed to place as high as he did, because his presentation was truly awful. 1997 marked a slight step backwards in terms of quality given Dorian's continued deterioration and the notable absence of Flex Wheeler. Yates still hung on to win in controversial fashion, with Nasser settling for second, Sean Ray in third, followed by Levrone, Dillette, and Lee Priest. And as great as Lee looked this year, and he was fantastic no doubt, I don't think he'd be able to best the much larger Brandon Curry if you stood them side by side. Look how much size Lee's giving up to everyone here, and Brandon Curry would have likewise dwarfed him. Okay, so that brings us to the end of Dorian's run, and by my estimation, Brandon Curry is making the top 6 every single year, the only possible exception being 1996. But the 90s aren't quite over yet, so even though Yates himself is now out of the picture, let's just go ahead and finish this up with the last 2 years. In 1998, it was Ronnie Coleman, Flex Wheeler, Nasser, Kevin, Sean Ray, and Cormier. And ironically, this might be the toughest group yet. There's not a single vulnerable bodybuilder in this mix, and I think Curry might genuinely be out of luck this time. It'd be tough to call since Brandon would be packing a lot more muscle on his frame pound for pound compared to most of these guys, but then again, they would all have a higher level of separation and muscle quality. It would really be like a case of apples and oranges, and I'm not confident Curry would be able to squeak past anyone here. So let's concede 1 point to Dorian and move on. 1999 was the same names, just a different order. You had Ronnie Coleman, Flex Wheeler, Chris Cormier, Kevin Levrone, Sean Ray, and Nasser El-Sambadi. Super steep opposition once again. But he might be able to outperform this version of Nasser, which wasn't as good as what we'd seen in years past. El-Sambadi's condition was off, and so I think Curry would have a good shot of unseating him for that 6th spot. I don't see him beating any of the rest of the top 5, however. So yeah, guys, that's my 2 cents when it comes to how Brandon Curry would have actually measured up in the 90s. I'm definitely more optimistic about his chances than Dorian, who seems to only be concerned with conditioning above all else. Now, for the record, I watched Valuetainment's entire 2-hour interview with him and agree with like 90% of everything Dorian said there, and I can certainly see where he's coming from with this. Conditioning is extremely important after all, and a 2019 Brandon Curry was simply not up to par. I said as much in past videos where I mentioned that he just didn't seem to be upholding the standard and the precedent established by previous Mr. Olympias with the condition that he was in. But saying that he couldn't even crack top 6, that's a little harsh and probably not true if you really look into it. Unfortunately, I couldn't go as in-depth here as with my last 90s comparison featuring Phil Heath, because I wanted to cover all 10 years, and also it's difficult to find any quality photos of guys outside the top 3 for these old shows. But I think you guys get my point. Out of all the 90s Olympia contests, there's only 2 times where I doubt he could have cracked into the top 6, 1996 and 98. Every other year, there was at least one guy who was off, or too small, or just a shit poser in the case of Paul Dillette, that I believe Curry could have taken advantage of. But that's all for this one. Thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed, and if so, please hit that like button and subscribe for more bodybuilding commentary and analysis. Until next time, this has been the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.